Hello, and welcome to this, the Savage Balance Podcast. Hello everyone, and welcome to this episode number 25 of the Savage Balance Podcast. How you doing out there, guys? Are you doing well? Are you doing good? Are you enjoying the longer days, the brighter days? Dare I say it, the slightly warmer days? Today is a windy day, but it's certainly got that sun and that kind of residual heat that you really enjoy. We're moving further and further into spring, and it's a time when people will be looking to be outside more and more in nature, going through walks and visiting beaches, but also in their gardens more, maybe just sitting there chilling out, or maybe getting their fingers nice and grubby and dirty. So anyway, this seemed like a very appropriate and ideal time to release this conversation that I recorded with Piers Warren. Piers Warren is an environmentalist, musician, teacher, cook, and veganic veg-grower. He is the founder of WILDEYE, which is the International School of Wildlife Filmmaking. He is also the author of a number of books, including How to Store Your Garden Produce, and The Vegan Cook and Gardener, Growing, Storing, and Cooking Delicious Food All Year Round, to which there is a link below in the show notes. Certainly a book that I really want to get my hands on. We discuss a huge range of topics in this show, including, but not limited to, veganic gardening, global agriculture, upscaling organic farming, eating seasonally, dealing with pests veganically, that's something that's always in my mind, and the social and emotional elements of gardening and nature. It's a really wonderful conversation, especially for somebody like me who doesn't have green fingers but really wants to, would love to have an allotment, would love to have more of that drive and knowing how to grow vegetables and when to pick them and how to eat more seasonally. It was a really useful and inspirational conversation for me to hear. This was originally recorded on the 7th of March 2021 over Skype for Future Vegan, a show I present on Future Radio 107.8 FM, which is the UK's first vegan radio show. If you like this, why not check out some of our previous episodes, especially some of our conversations we've recorded with vegan long-distance runner and sanctuary runner, Fiona Oakes. That's episode 21. Episode 28, there was a conversation around seaweed and immune health and sort of the richness of how they work in a vegan diet with Simon Ranger. And episode 3 and 4, one of the first ones I ever recorded, was a conversation with Juliet Galatly from the charity Viva, talking about zoonotic disease and coronavirus and how they relate to animal agriculture. There's also episode 12, which has a sort of I guess, suggestions about Veganuary, and also a piece I wrote called Vegan Senses, which is just a sort of fun, silly take on veganism through the other 4 senses, so not just taste, but sight, touch, sound, all of those sorts of things. So check that out. It's something I was pretty proud of. That's episode 12. Just a brief warning that the microphone died towards the end of this conversation, so I had to rely on the Zoom quality, which is not up to normal standard. But as this really only affects the last few sentences that I personally say, and so most of the conversation is completely fine, the whole thing's still listenable and you can hear what I'm saying, so don't let that put you off. We've still got many minutes that will give you lots of inspiration, I hope. Anyway, that's enough waffle from me. This is episode 25, a conversation with Piers Warren. So I'm joined today by Piers Warren. How are you doing today?
Yeah, fine, thanks. Thanks for having me on the show.
No, great. I am really genuinely looking forward to this. This is something I'm quite passionate about and also not very knowledgeable about, so it's a good combination. So the first, I think, and maybe most obvious and pressing question I can imagine on our listeners' minds is really, what is vegan gardening? What makes gardening non-vegan, and I guess incorporating ideas of veganic gardening into that sort of idea, really?
Yes, well, veganic is a relatively new phrase which we've adopted from the Americans, really, and it's very simply a combination of the words vegan and organic, and it means gardening without any animal products, basically. So no animal manures or anything like that, which of course means that we have to look at other ways of nourishing the soil to feed our plants. And there's lots of ways of doing this, which we can talk about some of those. But yes, it is the healthiest and most sustainable way to garden and grow our food.
Would people be surprised what's non-vegan in terms of gardening? What sort of things? I'm imagining myself. Usually, the more I delve into these things, the more I realise that there's a lot of gaps that I don't realise. You mentioned manures there, and I guess sort of pesticides and things come into that as well. Are there any other examples you can think of?
Well, there are lots of commonly purchased fertilizers which contain animal products, and some of them are pretty obvious, like blood, bone, and fish is a very common fertilizer, and which is clearly an animal product. But you can find things in others that you may not expect. So you might find, a box of fertilizer which actually contains some crushed bone that's come from a slaughterhouse, and that's not really mentioned unless you look at the small print. So yes, and of course, any animal manure from a domestic animal, whether it's horse manure or chicken dung, for example, you can understand why people say, well, it's a waste product. What's the problem with using it? And there are several reasons. Of course, one of them is that if we buy anything that's a byproduct of the slaughter industry, like blood, fish, and bone, then we are adding value to the slaughter industry, which of course is something we really don't want to do as vegans. The other reason for not using things like manures is that you don't know what's in them in terms of, let's take horse manure, for example, which is very commonly used in gardens and allotments, and you can easily purchase it. You've got no idea of knowing what the horse has been treated with. So very commonly, it may be treated with antibiotics, for example, other medicines. If we're talking about animals raised for meat, like chickens and cows, then they will also be treated with all sorts of hormones and things like that. And these chemicals, they excrete all the excess, which is a lot of it. So their manure and dung is containing these chemicals, which you then put into the soil and then goes up into the plants. So you end up eating, although it looks like a perfectly innocent tomato, it may well contain traces of antibiotics and hormones and things like that, which you really don't want to be putting in your system.
Yeah, it's amazing, incredible, isn't it? When as soon as you start to break it down, how much of this stuff really filters into the food we eat in a very, I imagine for a lot of people, quite an innocent way. You have some pests or some bugs and you want to get rid of them. You spray them with this, or you need a bit more fertilizer, so you use a bit of that. And yeah, it can really mount up and sneak in sort of unsuspectingly if you're not aware of what you're participating in.
Yes, and innocently too, in terms of, a lot of people will say, as I said earlier, what's the harm in using a byproduct? They may have a friend who lives next door who's got a horse and occasionally offers them a bag of horse manure. And you can see why people think it's a harmless thing to do. But as I said, there are possible negative sides to that.
Yes, yeah, you've made them very clear, because I can imagine, as you've just mentioned there, from that innocent perspective, it can feel like you're doing the right thing, the positive thing. If you're just getting some manure that is a waste product, and you're finding that use for it, it can be, important and actually quite essential. But then, as you say, the hormones and the antibiotics that come with it, and also supporting industries that go with that. And I guess as well, potentially even diets and stuff, that's the poor diets that a lot of animals in those conditions can have, that don't meet their sort of what they've been bred to eat naturally. Not what they've been bred to eat, but the conditions they've naturally found themselves in to eat, like, different grasses and different grass varieties and stuff like that. Instead, they're being fed soy and things like that aren't right for their guts, and that's going to have an impact on the quality of the manure as well, I imagine.
Yes, absolutely. And so far, we've talked about the negatives of using animal products, but another aspect to veganic growing is that we've proved that animal products are just not necessary. And you find, certainly in the permaculture world, for example, that a lot of permaculture people think that animal waste products are an essential part of feeding our soil, but that's just not the case. And we have people like, for example, there's a grower called Ian Tolhurst who has a farm in Oxford where he's been growing veganically on a commercial scale. So we're talking of a lot of acres here, and he provides veg boxes and things like that to various people. And he's been doing this for 40 years. So it's not like it's a, bit of recent data. He's been doing it for decades, and not only producing extremely healthy produce with no animal inputs whatsoever, but also he's been doing it extremely efficiently. So it's not even a case of saving money or producing cheaper crops. He's proved through decades of success that it's a healthy and efficient way to grow as well.
That's wonderful. And actually, that's a thought that I've had, and something I was interested in asking about, which is that I imagine a lot of people interfacing with the idea of vegan gardening and organic gardening could imagine it on a small scale, and it's something that somebody could do in their own back garden on an allotment, but scaling it up would be the issue. But as you mentioned there, that is not only possible and achievable, but you can flourish from it as well.
Yes, as you say, it can be done on all scales, even from a small garden right up to a commercial farm. And it's just a matter of adopting techniques to do this. And these days, these days you can learn them through a whole host of sources. So Ian Tolhurst himself runs his own courses on various aspects of veganic agriculture. There's a number of books out there, and other places are now running courses. A great way to find out more about all of this is through the Vegan Organic Network, and their web address is veganorganic.net. So they're a charity that produces lots of information and runs events and things like that, all about exactly this, growing vegetables and food veganically. And yes, they also have a lot of information, practical advice on their website. One thing I've just done with them recently is produced a new section on garden advice. So if you go to their website, you'll see on the main menu there's a section farm and garden advice, and if you click on that, choose garden advice, it'll take you through all the different methods you need to employ to do this, and including also a guide of what to do throughout the year. So if you're looking in March, it will tell you what to sow in March, what to plant out, what to harvest, etc. And that goes through all the months of the year.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I was looking through that today, in fact, and I was, I wasn't going to say surprised, but it's really in depth. Like and it's very clearly and easily laid out, because it starts off with you splitting things into 4 key sections around sort of vegan organic gardening and when to grow and when to plant, and then more on herbs and salad leaves. Is that correct? I believe that's the one of the 4.
Yes, there's 2 sections, salad leaves and herbs, which are separate from the month by month what to do, and that's just because, especially if you've got a place to grow indoors, even if it's just a windowsill, or you've got a greenhouse or something like that, there's a lot of herbs and salads that you can grow all year round. So rather than in the main menu every month say, oh, you can sow some parsley seeds this month, they have their own separate section which explains how you can grow these things year round.
Fantastic. Yeah, and the vegan organic section is, I mean, again, that's split into sort of subcategories, which are, if I'm right, these are all extracts from your book. Is that right? From your latest book?
Yes, that's right. My book is called The Vegan Cook and Gardener, and I co-wrote it with my daughter, actually, who's called Ella B. Glendinning. And initially it started out as a recipe book because we'd both been vegans for some years, and we developed a lot of recipes, and they're good kind of homely recipes that anybody can do. And I think our starting point for doing this was that because we were vegans, we bought vegan recipe books, and some of them were pretty complicated and contained loads of ingredients that we'd never heard of, and we didn't know where to get hold of them. And then you couldn't envisage what it would turn out like. So we wanted to create something much more wholesome, just using everyday ingredients. And of course, alongside this, I've been a keen vegetable gardener ever since I was a little boy. So when we got talking to the publishers about the idea for the book, we got round to thinking, well, let's tie in the gardening side of it as well. And so the book can encompass the whole thing, right from sowing that first seed until you make your dish at the end. And again, we've done it all seasonally. So not only is the growing advice seasonal, what to do in April, what to do in May, etc., but also the recipes are also split up by month, so that you are eating the very freshest produce that's available in your garden at that particular time.
From what you're just saying there, I mean, that all sounds fantastic. And really, for me, I feel like you're describing a lot of my experience with cooking books and also with understanding gardening more, because I guess the gardening aspect of it and understanding what is in season and what is out of season, especially when, for somebody like me who hasn't had that much time understanding what grows seasonally, when it grows seasonally, and mainly seeing things in supermarkets when things are mainly there all year round, it's very difficult to understand what to cook, what to grow, how to use it, when to plant it. And the idea of encompassing all of that in one place, in one book, sounds phenomenal and sounds exciting for me, actually.
Yes, and the other aspect, of course, is that a lot of people will buy the ingredients they want without really thinking in terms of, are they in season? We've been led towards this because supermarkets will offer just about any sort of produce at any time of the year, regardless of its own seasonality. And a good example of this is asparagus, which, it's a lovely vegetable and a lot of people like it. A lot of vegans love it, but it's only in season in this country in a really short period around sort of May time. but you can buy it in the shops all year round. And it mostly comes from Peru. And ridiculously, even when our own British asparagus is in season and available in shops, you can still buy it from Peru in shops at the same time. And for people who don't read labels very much, they might unwittingly buy that. The problem being that because a vegetable like asparagus has a relatively short shelf life, it is flown here, and anything that's flown has a far higher carbon footprint than anything that comes by ship, for example, which is why eating something like bananas, which is almost impossible to grow in this country without very big hothouses. So the vast majority of our bananas come from places like the Caribbean and South America and places in Africa as well. But they have a long shelf life, so they're harvested when they're still green, and then they're shipped over on big cargo ships, and they have a relatively low carbon footprint, unlike something like asparagus. And it is a huge contrast. I mean, for example, asparagus or anything actually coming by air may have 100 times higher carbon footprint than if the same thing came by ship.
That's a pretty shocking statistic, and I really want to ask you more about agriculture and our sort of global food systems, but just for people listening who may not be too aware, can you explain a bit about why eating things off season can be potentially harmful, and in what things it can be harmful to?
Well, if we're eating things that are in season, especially things that we can grow in this country, then the food miles, as we call it, tends to be shorter because they can come maybe from a grower down the road, ideally our own garden, of course, rather than somewhere on the other side of the world. So if it's shipped huge distances, then, of course, along with that comes all the pollution, CO2 gases, etc., that go along with that. So that increases its carbon footprint, and also means that it won't get to us in the best condition. The very freshest, healthiest produce is that's just been picked. And there's nothing better than in the afternoon when you're trying to think about what you're going to have for your supper that night. There's nothing better than just wandering around your garden with a basket under your arm, picking things that are completely ready that day, totally fresh, and that's absolutely the healthiest way to eat. Anything that's can come a short distance may have to go through various processes to keep it looking fresh. But of course, it won't be as healthy. There's commercially, there's lots of ways of doing that using temperature-controlled systems, humidity, gases, all sorts of other things. But it's never going to be as healthy as something you've just picked that afternoon.
That's wonderful. And what I like about that answer is I feel like a lot of things that tend to be that we can do for the right reasons tend to affect many different aspects. So eating in season not only helps with health, but it helps with the environmental damage as well, and then also affects. You would be more prone to buying things more locally, which helps more local economy, which keeps local communities in a better, healthier state economically. Allotments as well, to me, seem like the perfect solution in which it ticks so many boxes. And I think about our global food systems and how most people get their food, and it seems a difficult habit to break and difficult to know what to do. Do you have any advice or thoughts about how people, for example, I guess a lot of it ties into people struggling themselves monetarily wise as well, not having the physical means to put the money where they wish to put it. Do you have any advice or thoughts about how people, on relatively low incomes can invest further away from global food systems and more into local and sort of close by farmers and farming?
Yes, well, growing your own food is an inexpensive thing to do, let alone the fact that it's healthy exercise, it's fun, it's social as well, especially if you have an allotment plot. And allotment plots aren't successful. I think the last one I had was it was something like £30 a year for a whole plot, which is a very small amount of money compared to the amount of produce you can get from it. And there are certain things that you can end up being self-sufficient in with just a bit of careful planning. Things like potatoes and onions, garlic and things like that. It's dead easy to grow enough to keep you self-sufficient for those at a much smaller cost than if you grew if you bought those same quantities from a market or a supermarket or something like that. If you think of seeds, for example, seeds are pretty inexpensive compared to the amount of produce you can get from the result. And if you do team up with other people, whether they're neighbours or local people in the village, there's often village clubs, gardening clubs you can join, or other allotment holders, then there can be an awful lot of swaps which can really help people out. Because if you buy a packet of seeds and it's got 500 seeds in it of a certain cabbage or something, it's pretty unlikely you're going to want to grow 500 cabbages. But if you swap them with your friends and you get some seeds back of something that you haven't bought, then you can grow a wide variety. And of course, the wider the variety of foods that you grow, the healthier it is. We all hear about eating the rainbow, for example, lots of different colours to your foods. But all variety is good. No one fruit or veg is going to give you everything you need. But if you have a really good mixture, then you can definitely thrive on that.
Yeah, I imagine not just good for for your own health, but also the health of the soil as well, and keeping it enriched with lots of different nutrients as well, right?
That's right. We don't want monocrops where you grow just one thing in a huge field, which is of course very commonly done commercially, simply because it's easy. It's not healthy for us or the soil or the animals. Much better to have a mixed system, like people used to do hundreds of years ago. Of course, a farmyard of a few hundred years ago had a little bit of everything. It didn't just grow a massive field of corn and nothing else.
Do you have any thoughts yourself personally about how to address things like monocultures and other practices as well, like that, and different ways of addressing, a reliance on, I guess, animal agriculture, sort of, I guess, nationally and globally? Have you got any thoughts about how, for example, if you were suddenly in charge of global agriculture, do you have any thoughts about what things you would implement?
Yes, of course, I'd love to be in charge of global agriculture. And I think the big shift that we've got to make is that we know that we can grow in a much more healthy and efficient way. The only problem is it will need more manpower to make it work. So, for example, take a field of 1 acre that just grows, let's say, wheat, for example. It will give you a certain amount of calories, nutrients, from that acre. If you took that same acre and you grew it more like you would an allotment site, so you had lots and lots of different beds growing all types of different fruit and veg, then the amount of nutrition, calories, health, etc., that you would get from exactly the same piece of land would be far greater. The only problem is it will need more people to look after it. And that's the difficult thing to get your head around these days, is that on the one hand, we've got people who need work and would like healthy work, and for some reason don't like the idea of working on the land. So in this country, you know, for years and years, we've been used to bringing over people from often from places like Eastern Europe, for example. Those workers will come over and they will do all our harvesting and all the work on the land. And partly because they will accept a lower wage than local people with, but also it's something they're happy to do. And for some reason, local people don't want to work in the fields. But people who have allotments, for example, will tell you that it's one of the healthiest, best things that they ever do, and they can't wait to get down on the plot. So it's a conundrum of how do we get people more excited about working on the land and growing their own produce. And I think this is partly through education, which is why organisations like the Vegan Organic Network is so important. And, you know, I hope more and more people will get involved with that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really great source. I was already going down wormholes when researching and getting questions together to ask you. I was already going down plenty of wormholes on their site. I remember reading something to do with the UK leaving the EU, and it was addressing people's thoughts about how export and import will work from other countries in terms of food. And the article was mainly talking about how actually there's a far greater thing to be worried about in terms of more close to home in the UK, which is, as you mentioned, a lot of workers from the European Union being here and picking the crops, and the fact that they will not be able to facilitate those jobs. So a lot of British crops will not have efficient enough workers to work on the land and to pick the land. And that's something that I feel like does really need addressing, and especially when, as you mentioned, they're willing to do the work for less of the money. That's one big aspect of it. And I remember hearing his name is Professor Paul Dolan. He's I can't remember what he is, some kind of he's a professor at the London School of Economics, and he's talking about social mobility and saying it's more economic mobility. And actually, there will always be a level of low-skilled jobs that will need to be available, that will need to be done manually. And a lot of social mobility is talking about, people should be aspirational and look for more sort of middle-class jobs, more office jobs with higher pay and stuff like that. But really, we should be celebrating the lower-skilled jobs more and more, and making them more palatable, more appetizing, and more enjoyable for people. So if there was more money and that job was celebrated more, then maybe that would be a way for people to actually do this work, as you say, which affects social aspects and sort of connection to nature and the health, like the health of being outside all day and the vitamin D from the sunlight and touching nature and all those things.
Yeah, definitely agree with all of that. And of course, it's a much healthier life to be outside in the sun doing something physical rather than sitting in front of a computer in an office. It's almost hard to understand why people would find working in an office more appealing than being outside in the sunshine. So yes, it's it's a whole variety of these shifts that people as a whole need to make. And of course, you're talking about Europe, but a lot of the food that we eat in this country is imported. A lot of it from Europe, but all around the world as well. And it's completely needless. We have far more land, productive land in the UK than we need to be entirely self-sufficient for food. One of the key things, of course, which is where us vegans come in, is that growing meat is extremely inefficient. So if you're, again, let's go back to our field of 1 acre. If that amount of land is used to grow food to feed cattle for beef, compared to the same amount of land used to grow food to feed humans, then the difference is about 10 to 20 times. So for the same piece of land, you could feed 10 to 20 times more people using plant products, which are more healthy than if you were to feed them meat. I mean, it just feels like a no-brainer, doesn't it? And yet still, a huge amount of the land that's used for growing food in the UK is taken up either by livestock or growing plants to feed the livestock. And this is now common knowledge, and the solution is pretty clear. It's just a question of, how long will it take us to get to that point where we don't even need to import food. And you have to accept things like, yes, eating asparagus is brilliant, but why do we need to do it every day of the year? Why can't we just enjoy asparagus in May and June and then spend the rest of the year looking forward to when we can grow it again next year, rather than having it all the time? So it's various shifts in the way of thinking about food, but in my mind, they're not all negative shifts. They're all things we can embrace.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. Like the idea of sort of accessibility 24/7 for people has very easily understood. What am I trying to say? It's very clear to see the links between a life of convenience and trying to have everything available to people as often as possible, and the destruction of the environment, and the sort of problems with climate change and the strain that's put on our planet. They're very clearly, easily linked, and there's big links between animal agriculture. Do you have any thoughts or ideas of how to encourage, say, animal farmers to a more to I guess a more veganic way of looking at things and approaching things? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there are now a number of farmers who used to deal with products like beef, for example, who have now switched to growing plant produce, and hopefully there will be many more. And it's all a matter of education and trying to persuade people that tradition isn't necessarily a good thing. Just because something's been done in a certain way for hundreds and hundreds of years doesn't mean it's right. Like slavery, for example. Slavery, well, there is still a bit of slavery, but obviously there's far less than there was hundreds and hundreds of years ago, because we gradually came to realize it wasn't the right thing to do. And hopefully this will be the same with growing animals, which of course is a form of slavery in itself, simply for the taste of their flesh. So hopefully more farmers will go plant-based, and they will find that it's it's not only a kinder way to live, not bringing up animals to be slaughtered, but also it's also, could be just as profitable or even more profitable, and a better, healthier way to use the land that produces less pollution and things like that. And there are various initiatives around to help farmers make the switch. I know the Vegan Society runs one. I think it's called Growing Green or something like that, where they have lots of advice on their own website, and they can also advise farmers individually if they get in touch with them. And Vegan Organic Network do this as well, because I think we're realizing it's not just a matter of teaching individual people how to do this in their own gardens and allotments, but to make a big difference, especially with something like climate change, we need to get a lot of the farmers switching as well.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree with what you're saying. A couple of sort of quick fire thoughts I've just had that are more specific things. I was wondering, first of all, how well ideas about rewilding fit with kind of veganic farming. And I was also thinking about specifically thinking how people deal with pests when growing veg, and even if pests is the right term to be using, really. Because I imagine people thinking, I want to grow things. This sounds interesting to me, organic and vegan, and yet when there are pests there, I don't know how to deal with them other than using the sprays, the pesticides, and such. Have you got any thoughts on those?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with you. The word pests itself is something I hope we can use less of, in the way that the word vermin, it feels really outdated now. What is a vermin animal? Why is that different from any other animal? A lot of it just doesn't make sense. It's just tradition that needs to be got rid of now. But yeah, certainly in terms of dealing with what are traditionally called pests. So something like aphids is a very obvious one. Aphids, which will infest a whole range of plants in the garden. And for me, I think it started with a shift of the way I think about these things. So, for example, a traditional vegetable grower will want the absolute maximum crop from their available amount of space. Any pest that reduces this crop used to be just got rid of, usually with a spray, some sort of insecticide, which will kill often everything, all insects, not just the ones that you're targeting, so it will also affect the good ones. And you've got no way of knowing how much of that pesticide will then end up either in the crop or on the crop that you then ingest yourself. And when the companies that produce these chemicals, when they do their checks to make sure that they're safe to use for your average grower, they often do them in a reductionist way, by which I mean they will test the level of that chemical that would start to cause a health problem. And of course, they part of the way they do that is by testing these on lab animals to see what level makes these animals sick. The whole thing is horrible in itself, the whole process. But what can never be measured is the effects of all these different chemicals combined. Because, of course, the food that we eat hasn't been just treated with one chemical. It's been treated with a whole variety of different chemicals, pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, all sorts. Hundreds and hundreds of different products. And the permutations of these are so many that you could never test every possible different mixture of these. So you can never really know how bad they are for your health, and whether actually this cocktail of chemicals that people are taking in is producing things like the increases we see in allergies and asthmas and cancers and things like that. Why not err on the side of caution and just not use them at all, because they're just not necessary. Anyway, I was talking about this kind of mental switch I made, and that the first one was to think that not every single thing I grow in my garden is necessarily for me to eat. Why not also grow some for other creatures to eat, which could include things like aphids? And so if I have a load of plants, let's say 10% of them are affected by aphids, then that's completely fine. And if I have a few aphids on my plot, then those aphids will attract other creatures like ladybirds, lacewings, hoverflies, all of which the larvae of which will eat aphids. So I will be boosting the biodiversity of my plot by having aphids. If the minute you see an aphid, you kill it with a spray, then you will never get ladybirds and hoverflies and lacewings, because there's nothing for them to eat. And therefore, if that's why you suddenly get these blooms of pests, because there are no predators to feed on them. So, it's almost good news. If I see a plant in the garden with a few aphids on, I think, oh, great, pretty soon we'll have some ladybirds and hoverflies and things like that. So that was my first shift. And I remember hearing once a woman saying about her garden, if I only get to eat 10% of what I plant, then I'm happy to share the rest. And that really made me think, because, of course, people go nuts if they lose 10% of their crop to pests, whereas she was happy to only have 10%. So sharing your plot with other creatures is a really nice thing to do. When you're out in the garden, it's much nicer if you're surrounded by bees and hoverflies and ladybirds and things than if you're working on just a sterile plot that's drenched with chemicals. So yeah, that's definitely a big incentive apart from the health side.
I love that. That's a really beautiful way of changing perspective on what you're doing and what you're doing it for as well. That connection to nature and understanding that you are part of it. You're not separate from it. You're not going, I'm growing these for me, get off. You need to. It's all a part of the same thing. Like the air that we breathe wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the trees themselves, and the food we eat wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the pollinators that grow it, and the water that is part of the sky. Like, that's how we drink and survive. We are very much connected and part of this whole thing. And I really like how that ties in, that way of seeing, in air quotations, pests. That's a lovely way of incorporating those two things.
Yeah, and of course the other thing is that as veganic growers, we actively encourage wildlife into our plots, because that is the healthy system we want. So sometimes when people hear that we grow without any animal inputs, they think our plot is barren of any animal life, whereas that's not the case at all. We just don't have livestock, and we don't use livestock products, but definitely encourage animals, whether they're birds, frogs, hedgehogs, ladybirds, the whole lot. The wider variety of all this you have, the more complete the ecosystem is, and therefore the healthier all the plants will be, including the plants that you grow to eat yourself.
That's really fantastic. That's beautiful. I really appreciate your time. And I just want to wrap things up with a final thought, imagining somebody listening to this thinking, I'm inspired. I really like this idea of incorporating vegan and organic into gardening, and I want to do this stuff, but I have a busy life. I have limited resources. I have limited space. What advice would you give for somebody who's maybe looking to start incorporating it in, who maybe doesn't have the time or the space they'd ideally like to have?
I'd say just start small, even if it's just growing a few herbs on your windowsill. It's a start, and everybody starts small. And if you're anything like me and a lot of other growers, you will very quickly get the bug. And it isn't hugely time consuming. To grow veg in your own garden doesn't necessarily take longer than going to the shops to buy the same thing. Plus, it's healthy. Get outside in your garden, get a bit of fresh air and exercise. You see so many people who will do a whole series of things like going to the gym, driving to the supermarket, all these different things to get healthy, fit, and get food, when just growing your own, even in your own garden, can tick all those boxes for free.
Phenomenal. That's really, it's beautiful. Thank you very much for your time. I feel a lot more informed, and I loved our chat, and I feel like there's still 10 or 20 questions buzzing around my head, so maybe we could do something again sometime. How can people find out more about what you're doing? As we mentioned the book before, whereabouts can people get that? And what things are you up to, and where can people follow what you're doing?
Yes, well, the book is for sale through various outlets, including direct from the publisher, who are permanent publications, but also from the Vegan Organic Network site. So just to remind you, the website for that was veganorganic.net. And people can find out more about me and the other stuff I do from my own website, which is just simply pierswarren.co.uk.
Perfect. People definitely go and check those out and look at the book and maybe incorporate that into your life, because it sounds to me kind of almost in a way revolutionary, because you don't see this kind of cookbook out there, and you don't see this way of approaching what you eat like available in such a way. Like you mentioned earlier, it's normally a case of picking up a thing and you go, where do I get that ingredient from? How do I get that? Or going, the only way I can purchase that part is wrapped in plastic, and I'd like to make this. And understanding what you can make yourself, what you can grow yourself, and then what you can make from that. The whole experience as itself is really beautiful. So people should definitely look into that and think about purchasing it for sure. Thank you very much for your time. I've genuinely really enjoyed this, and you're a very wonderful person. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben. It's been great talking to you.
Oh, you too. Thank you. And there we go. Thank you very much for listening, guys. That was the conversation recorded with Piers Warren. Wonderful stuff, a really inspirational conversation. I learned a lot, and it was just wonderful spending time in his company. So thank you very much to him. Do check out the show notes, including a link to the Vegan Cook and Gardener, growing, storing and cooking delicious healthy food all year round. It's available to purchase on there. It's also, I think, a little bit cheaper at the moment, so it's a good time to pick it up. There's also a link to the veganic gardening tips we discussed in that conversation on the Vegan Organic Gardening website, which is actually extracts from Piers Warren's book. So if you want to read those first, see if you like the advice and the way that it's written, and click on that other link. There's also a link to Piers Warren's website as well, so check all of those out. Why not rummage through our back catalogue as well? There's plenty of stuff there, including links to stuff talking about addiction, daily practices, proportional representation, minimalism, as well as those interviews I mentioned earlier with Fiona Oakes, Juliet Gallatley and Simon Ranger. And the veganuary stuff as well, and the vegan senses piece there. because, veganuary is not for Christmas, and it's not just for after Christmas as well, it's for life. Share this podcast with your friends, why don't you? We have an Instagram, Savage Balance Podcast, and we have a Twitter at SavBalPod. You can also tell people via your mouth and the words that you use to communicate to people. Just say there's a podcast that exists to maybe your friends or to family members or co-workers, and they'll go, "Oh, right," and they won't listen. But then if you keep saying it, maybe they might listen. So maybe try that technique. It might work. Why not? Give it a go, eh? We have an email, savbalpod@gmail.com. You can send me any thoughts you have, any criticisms, any future guest ideas, any further conversations you want to have about stuff, or if you want to inform me about things I might have missed out. Let me know, savbalpod@gmail.com. The website is savbalpod.com. You can subscribe, you can comment, you can rate, and you can review. You can do all those things. The artwork is by Dolly Gray. The music is by Danny Tonks. Thank you very much for listening, and thanks once again to Piers Warren. I'll be back next week, but until then, why not go get your little grubby fingers out in that soil, dig them deep, feel that soil betwixt your fingers, feel the breeze, feel the warmth, feel the stillness, or maybe the bluster of nature. Sit in it, look at some birds flying over your head, see if there's any worms around, and watch them for a while, and just enjoy nature and enjoy being outside. And if you don't have any nature or gardens, well, maybe visit a park and, well, maybe not dig up the soil in a park. That's probably not good practice, is it? To just go and, by the goalpost, dig a ginormous hole and start, I don't know, planting daisies. That's the only plant I could think of. I was thinking of like petunias, but I don't know if petunia is a plant. I'm a long way off. Having green fingers, aren't I there? Anyway, thanks very much for listening, guys. I will talk to you next week. Have a good one. See you later.